Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I would like to talk about clause 27, and this is method of voting. And there's a little bit of confusion. I apologise, Mr Chair, I'm just a simple boy from the region, so hopefully someone will be able to enlighten me. What it says in method of voting, Mr Chair, is 27.1. This is talking about the first flag referendum. It says 27 part 1A, an elective voting in the first referendum must, now the word must is important because in legislation we have the word must, which compels someone, and we have the word may, which does not compel, but it recommends. So it says must mark the voting paper by expressing the first preference for one option, okay? So if someone only has, so you've got to put a 1, for example, a 1, 2, 3, 4, and it sets it out in the schedule how this is supposed to be. And I suppose my concern about this, Mr Chair, is in the second referendum, so 27.2, it talks about you must mark the vote, you must again, it's used the word must, mark the voting paper with a tick in the circle. Now, where this breeds a little bit of confusion, and I'm again would like the Minister to sort of give me a little bit, enlighten me on this, is if, for example, in that first referendum, if a voter doesn't put 1, 2, 3 or 4, or only has one flag design that they would like, and they tick that box, is that valid, or is that vote informal, or does it still stand if a voter has given a very clear preference for their flag design? So perhaps there should even be a 27.1c, which says, for example, if it is obvious that the elector has clearly indicated a preference for only one design, this shall be deemed a valid vote. And again, it comes. I have the same point, Mr Chair, around 27.2, where it says again, this is the second referendum here, where there is only 2 preferences. So it's the New Zealand flag, the current New Zealand flag, and the design that wins out of the first preference. And it says an elective voting in the second flag referendum must mark the voting paper with a tick in the circle. And my concern about this, Mr Chair, is if, for example, I'm assuming, I'm making an assumption here, which could be right or mightn't be, if people have partaken in the first referendum, where it's a 1, 2, 3 or 4, in the second referendum, if they put a 1 as opposed to a tick in one of the boxes, but it is still very clear that their preference is for one of the options, i.e. they haven't spoilt the paper in any way, will that vote be informal? And this, again, perhaps there should have been a 27.2a, where it says, if it is obvious that the elector has clearly indicated a preference for only one design, this shall be deemed a valid vote. Now, if we go to clause 32, it talks about informal voting papers. And this is where I'm a little bit confused, Mr Chair, because as mentioned, I do this a lot, you look at the writing of the legislation, because it has to be tight for a reason, we all understand that, and this is where the word must and may changes quite substantially off in a clause in legislation. Now it says here, a voting paper is informal if the returning officer is satisfied in the case of the first flag referendum that the voting paper does not clearly indicate the voter's first preference. So to me, Mr Chair, this says that in that first referendum, if a person puts a tick or puts a cross just beside one preference, then that vote is valid. However, in clause 27.1a, that may indicate that that vote is ruled out. And again, it says, and I have the same concern, Mr Chair, for 27.2 in the second preference, where it says that the elector must tick the second flag referendum with a tick in a circle. But again, we look at informal votes here, and it's 32b, which is in the case of the second flag referendum that the voting paper does not clearly indicate. So we're talking about a definition of an informal vote here. In the case of the second flag referendum, that the voting paper does not clearly indicate the option for which the elector wishes to vote. And I suppose my concern here, Mr Chair, is there is the sort of common sense aspect to this. And I'm assuming that the returning officer will use the common sense or the pragmatic approach, where even though the legislation says in the second referendum it must be a tick, If, however, the elector has put a cross or put a 1, but it is very, very clear what their preference is, Mr. Chair.
Jamie Lee Ross.
That the question be now put.
The question is that the question be now put. Those